I've got 11 names on the board. These are some of the all-time greats in my time watching hockey. I just kept it with basically forwards. Didn't get into defensemen or goaltenders in this one. I could talk about goaltenders in another video. That might be kind of fun to look at starting goaltenders that win Stanley Cups and everything. This will especially be fun when the final is over. So I'm not getting into some great specifics because right now, as I'm recording this, of course, the Oilers are in the Stanley Cup final. Connor McDavid, and we will talk about him last. But we're going to start with Gretzky. So we're going from Oiler to Oiler here. But there are 3 Pittsburgh Penguins on the board because, of course, there are, and I could have probably justified putting more in, but I wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So Gretzky and the Oilers made the Stanley Cup final the 4th year that he's in the National Hockey League. So I'm not including his time in the WHA because it doesn't make any sense. No Stanley Cup in the WHA. But that first year, they meet the Islanders in the final. They were a brick wall. It was the final Stanley Cup for the Islanders as well. 16 games in those playoffs for Gretzky, 12 goals, 26 assists, 38 points. Made it look easy, and then in the final, no. The following year, so year 5, Gretzky gets his first of 4 cup rings. 19 games, 13 goals, 22 assists, 35 points. So they beat the New York Islanders in the rematch the following season. And so for the Oilers, they get over that hump. And the discussion of Gretzky and whether or not he'd win, whether or not the Oilers would win with their offense, that's all put to rest in year 5. Mario Lemieux, and I'm wearing my Mario Lemieux jersey here, they reached the Stanley Cup final and win the Stanley Cup in year 7. What's interesting with the Penguins is that was only the 2nd playoff appearance for the Penguins. Yeah, after Lemieux gets there, the discussion was they were better, but they weren't necessarily a great team, and is Lemieux going to be the guy who gets them over the top? Well, year 7 he did. Plays 23 games in those playoffs, 16 goals, 28 assists, 44 points. So ridiculous point totals from Lemieux. That was the first of back-to-back Stanley Cups, of course, for Mario, the 2 that he won in his career. He's had some as an owner as well. I will throw that in there. Joe Sakic, of course, playing in Quebec, part of the move to Colorado. The first year in Colorado, they make the playoffs, they win the Stanley Cup. It was only the 3rd playoff appearance for Joe Sakic, the previous 2, of course, with Quebec. Plays 22 games in those playoffs, 18 goals, 16 assists, 34 points. 18 goals, very impressive for playoffs, right near that record. I think 19 is the record in a playoff year. And so Sakic, after many years of questions that Quebec, there was all this losing in Quebec, and is Sakic going to have bad habits because there's all this losing in Quebec and stuff that I read about? Yeah, that all went away. Quebec got better, and then when they went to Colorado, they win Stanley Cups, and of course, he's had a cup ring as well as a member of management with the Colorado Avalanche. So it's interesting to note the ones that end up being in management. Sometimes the greats are pretty good at the management side too, which brings us to Steve Yzerman. They didn't reach the finals, those Red Wings, until the 12th year that Yzerman's in the National Hockey League. And in those playoffs, 15 games, 4 goals, 8 assists, 12 points. There were plenty of doubters about Yzerman's ability to lead them to a Stanley Cup, whether or not he was built for playoffs. Year 14, they go back to the Stanley Cup final, and they win it. And in those playoffs, honestly, his totals weren't fantastic because at this point in his career, Yzerman's not about points, he's about winning. 20 games, 7 goals, 6 assists, 13 points. Yzerman, of course, also won a Stanley Cup on one leg. So, I mean, Yzerman, that was the first Stanley Cup in year 14, but then he wins a couple after that. And all of the discussions about whether or not he could win went away. Eric Lindros. So the only one on the board that did not win a Stanley Cup is Eric Lindros, because Lindros was seen as the next one. And I always felt bad for him with that. So you have the great one, Gretzky, the magnificent one, Mario Lemieux, and Lindros was seen as the next one. And I thought that's a lot of pressure to put on a kid. But Lindros played a very physical style of hockey. He was built for the playoffs. Eventually his body would break down because of the power forward game and just the hits he took. But in that Stanley Cup final appearance in year 5, and that's the only time he made the Stanley Cup final, it was his 3rd playoff appearance as well. 19 games, 12 goals, 24 assists, 26 points. And then they just ran into a team in the final that was the Detroit Red Wings who won the Stanley Cup. Sidney Crosby. So going back to Pittsburgh here, and the reason we're in Pittsburgh because they're on the board 3 times. Crosby reaches the final in year 3. Plays against Detroit. 20 games, 6 goals, 21 assists, 27 points for Crosby there. They lose in the final. I do remember some people saying, see, Crosby's not built for playoffs. He's not going to make it. The following year, he wins the Stanley Cup. So it took until year 4. 24 games, 15 goals, 16 assists, 31 points. So in his third playoff appearance and his second Stanley Cup final, he gets his first cup ring. He's got 3 of those now. So, yeah, Crosby, one of the all-time greats. Now, Ovechkin, it took a while. Finals and Cup in year 13. Prior to that, there were plenty of discussions about Ovechkin and the fact that they couldn't get over the hump in the playoffs. Will Ovi ever get over the hump in the playoffs? In that Stanley Cup final and win, that playoff season anyways, 24 games, 15 goals, 12 assists, 27 points. Jaromir Jagr, he didn't have to wait very long. He didn't go through the long suffering that some players do. He's in the final and wins the Cup his first year. Now, I debated about whether or not to put him on the board for the simple reason that first year he wasn't a key guy for Pittsburgh and he was a rookie. But in 24 games, 3 goals, 10 assists, 13 points. And of course, he's the all-time leader almost the all-time leader in games played when he left. Of course, he's third on the all-time games list because Marleau's number 1, Howe's number 2, and he's number 3. That's still pretty impressive. But again, his first year in the NHL, he has a Stanley Cup ring. Sometimes it works that way for players too. Steven Stamkos, finals in year 7, so that was 2015. 26 games, 7 goals, 11 assists, 18 points. The ironic part with Stamkos is there's all this discussion about how he doesn't win in Game 7s, and his Game 7 stats have been poor, which is true, but he gets the Stanley Cup ring in 2020 playing one game. And playing like a couple of minutes of that game. He did get a goal in that game. He was seen as an emotional boost for Tampa Bay. Part of the reason they win that Stanley Cup, but he only played in that one game. So what's interesting is that Stamkos wins the first of back-to-back cup rings, ditches that aura that, well, Stamkos can't play well in the playoffs, which had been there before then, even though he only had the one playoff game. It's just a matter of when he played and what it symbolized, and the fact he was captain. Yeah, Stamkos, the real deal. McKinnon. Before McKinnon wins that first Stanley Cup in year 9, there was plenty of talk about, well, McKinnon, they may need somebody else. He may not be the guy. In that Stanley Cup run in 2022, 20 games, 13 goals, 11 assists, 24 points. So for a Colorado team that when they get to the Stanley Cup final, they have a pretty good track record. McKinnon helped keep that track record perfect. And again, that's 2 Colorado players, Sakic and McKinnon. Must be fun to have one and then have the other in your organization. And then there's McDavid. So year 9 is where the Oilers find themselves currently. 22 games in the playoffs again, since this is after Game 4 of the final, just for anybody who's stumbling upon this video weeks or months from now. 6 goals, 32 assists, 38 points. A lot of, and rightfully so, a lot of talk about him breaking the assists record that was set by Gretzky many decades ago. McDavid, lots of talk about whether or not he's ever going to win a cup and is he good enough. But the reality is, for a lot of the other guys on this board, it took a while. Again, year 9 is a long time. But it was year 9 for McKinnon, year 13 for Ovechkin, year 12 for Yzerman. And if I had Brett Hull on the board, it'd be a long time before that first Stanley Cup for him as well. It would have been over a decade for him too. I had to leave Hull off because I left Messier off. And I was like, well, if I don't have Messier on the board, and again, I could do like 3 or 4 boards of this, but I feel like this is enough, right? I do wonder, the question then becomes one of, do you have to win a Stanley Cup to be considered one of the all-time greats? The only one on the board without a cup ring is Lindros, and it's tough to say that with Lindros because his career didn't last as long as it would have if not for injury. But I do think that while it's a team award, the Stanley Cup, obviously you can't just drag a team to a Stanley Cup and win it by yourself. The reality is that you probably do need a cup ring in order to be seen as one of the greatest of all time. There are those who haven't had that Stanley Cup ring, Marleau being mentioned, Thornton is another one, and potentially, Pavelski is taking a year off, probably retired at this stage. All from the Sharks. Sharks seen as a team that just couldn't quite get over the hump. I'll be making videos on that during the summer too, because it's interesting looking at certain eras for a team and how they just don't quite reach that level. But I don't put that just on the star player. I see it more as a team thing than a player thing. But I do understand that for a lot of fans, whatever happens, and in this case it's Edmonton, and with almost any player on the board here, the team's performance has been tied directly to the player before they get that championship. I understand why people take aim at the superstar player and go, well, why can't he do it then? And it's not really that simple, but I get it. But yeah, so there you go. I wanted to talk about how long it takes certain players. Yeah. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Question I have is, do you need to win a Stanley Cup in order to be seen as one of, I'm not saying the greatest, but one of the greatest of all time? And name off some guys that didn't win Stanley Cups that are considered to be greatest of all time. And again, I think sometimes it's just the organization you're in. That's why I feel bad when guys get drafted by Vancouver and they're really, really good, because in the back of my mind, I think, I don't know this team ever wins the Stanley Cup, not in my lifetime anyways, and we'll see, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But that is something that does occur to me at times where I'm like, man, this guy's going to win. He may have to